So I'm very happy to welcome Andrew Cohen to the Open Sky House. And we've already had a few hours together, and we already feel like pals. I know that's the right word. But it's very nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you and everyone. Thank you.
And I would say that the community would love to welcome you whenever you're traveling through Europe.
Thank you so much.
If you've got time to visit us, you're always welcome. There's always a room for you, and
thank you.
We're very happy to see you.
Very kind of you.
So I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out, but I prepared a few quotations of Andrew's from his website. So he will recognize them, and I'm sure he can unfold them for us. And I think the one he probably would like to start with is to tell us something about evolutionary enlightenment.
You're starting with a small question.
Yeah. You start with the easy ones. So he says here, evolutionary enlightenment calls on us to awaken to both the timeless peace of being, so I think we all know about that, and the relentless passion of the evolutionary impulse. So probably we're not so clear about that.
Oh, I can see it everywhere. Look all around me. Are you kidding? It looks like you know quite a lot about it.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I mean, there's another quote, there's only a couple of lines that goes with that one. Enlightenment is evolving. It is no longer found only in the bliss of timeless being. It is found also in the ecstatic urgency of evolutionary becoming. So I guess that's enough to prompt you into action.
So would you like me to explain that?
Yeah, if you could unfold that a bit for us, because I don't think we're really so aware about what you mean. Maybe we somehow understand it through our daily life, but I don't think we know what you're meaning about it.
Okay. So it might take a few minutes.
No, you could have as long as you like. Yeah.
Okay. So, let's try and imagine, and I want us all to be able to agree at the beginning on the fundamentals, that would you agree that the sum total of everything that exists would include everything that doesn't exist and everything that does exist? Would you agree, if we wanted to try and come up with an idea of the ultimate totality of everything, that in my way of thinking, that would have to include everything that exists and everything that does not exist. So do you agree that everything that exists and everything that does not exist would include the sum total of everything that exists and doesn't exist? Could anything exist outside those two? Of course not, you said. I agree with you. Does everybody get it? So we just want to get a picture. We want to get a picture of everything, if it's possible, with the mind. So this is just an exercise. It doesn't really, what I'm saying doesn't really mean anything, but we're just working with concepts to kind of attempt to have some conversation about evolutionary enlightenment. So we want to start with this basic agreement that we want to get a picture of everything. So the picture of everything would have to include the sum total of everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist. Everything that's manifest and everything that's unmanifest. Does everybody agree that would do it? That would cover everything? That nothing known or unknown, manifest or unmanifest, could exist out of the sum total of everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist? Does everybody agree? I can't. If you don't say you agree, I don't know if you agree or you just. Should I take that as an?
I think you can push on from that. Yeah.
Okay. So then what we'll do is we'll take a pic. You're obviously very visually oriented here, so imagine let's draw a big circle, and the circle represents the sum totality of everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist. Everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist exists inside the circle. Nothing that exists and nothing that doesn't exist exists outside the circle. Okay? We all together? So then what we want to do is draw a line through the middle of the circle. So we have two halves. And let's say on the left side of the circle is the unmanifest. So the unmanifest equals in spiritual metaphysical enlightenment language equals the ground of being. Timeless, formless, beginningless and endless. Nothingness, emptiness. And what we want to do is and the important thing to remember here, to keep in mind, that this timeless, formless, beginningless and endless ground of being was the empty, 0 point, and no place, or voidness from which the entire creative process emerged. 14 billion years ago, there was a big explosion. That was the beginning of time. Before the universe existed, before that initial explosion, there was no time, there was no space, there was no form. Nothing existed. It was complete voidness. You familiar with this idea? Before there was something, there was nothing. Before there was something, there was nothing. And everything that we could call something came from the nothing, comes from the nothing. Is that clear? So, in the traditional understanding of enlightenment, that Papaji, or when I knew him, he was before he was Papaji, he was Punjaji. What he revealed to me through his grace was this timeless, formless, beginningless and endless ground. And he introduced it to me in a way that was very powerful. I've never recovered. Changed my life. So I thought I was trapped in my separate personality, and then he opened up the door to infinity, and I walked through it, and I never came back. As I'm sure the same thing happened to you. I was with him only for 3 weeks. It happened very quickly. So in his presence, it became possible to have a direct cognition, a direct knowing of the infinite. And in this case, the infinite, in my understanding, means the direct awakening to recognition and knowing, direct knowing of this timeless, formless, beginningless and endless ground. And this timeless, formless, beginningless and endless ground is the substratum or the foundation of all of reality, because everything that exists in time and in space and in form has emerged from that empty void, from that timeless, formless, no place. So before the universe existed, there was nothing whatsoever. Before the universe existed, there was nothing whatsoever. Before the universe existed, there was nothing whatsoever. That's why Punjaji will make the bold statement, nothing ever existed. This was the quote from the book you just gave Daniela. So what that means, that nothing ever existed, means from the perspective or the vantage point of that timeless, formless, beginningless and endless empty ground, nothing ever happened. Because before there was time and space, before the universe was created, nothing ever happened. Before the universe was created, nothing ever happened. You'd never been born. Your parents weren't born. Weren't born. The universe wasn't even a thought in the mind of God. So before the universe was even a thought in the mind of God, nothing existed. So when either through the grace of a great master like Hari Lal Punjaji or Papaji, either through the grace of someone this deeply realized, or through our own meditative pursuits, we're able to directly become conscious of this depth dimension. It's a depth dimension where it's a non-relative or absolute depth dimension in which we discover limitlessness, because timelessness and formlessness are beginningless and endless. So this kind of awakening is like falling into an infinite ocean of being that always exists before time, before space, before the universe was even a thought in the mind of God. And that's why the unconditional freedom that we experience when we have that kind of awakening is truly unimaginable, because it precedes everything that has ever happened and everything that is going to continue to happen in the creative process. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
So in the traditional, what I call anyway, I make this distinction between in the traditional enlightenment or in the Advaitic position, it is said, or the interpretation of this kind of experience, is that the only thing that's real is that which is never born and that which is never dies. So this timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless ground is a place, is the deepest part of the self and the deepest part of reality itself, and it's a place where nothing ever happens. Nothing happens, nothing changes. It's changeless. And the Buddha called this depth dimension the unborn or the deathless. And to every part of you and me that has taken form and taken birth, the awakening to this depth dimension, this what the Buddha called the deathless and the unborn, is experienced as an unimaginable source, an inconceivable source of liberation from time, from space, from body, from form, and from mind. Right? Mm-hmm. So when we draw this circle, we realize we're saying now this is just an arbitrary idea, but we're drawing the circle and saying the left side of the circle represents this depth dimension that exists before the universe was created, and is always the deepest dimension of reality and of the self. If you dig down deep enough, well, that's where we're all going to end up. There's nowhere else to go. So, but we realize that's not the whole picture, because it seems that 14 billion years ago there was this huge explosion, and from nothing whatsoever, from timeless, formless emptiness, energy and matter appeared in a very dramatic way. It happened in an instant. From nothing came everything. And this is a very important thing to contemplate. Why did something come from nothing? Why did something come from nothing? But something or everything came from nothing in an instant. And initially what emerged was matter and energy. So matter and energy emerged from timeless, formless emptiness in a very dramatic, explosive way. The creation of the universe is the most dramatic event that's ever happened, and that is still happening right now. We are all products of that explosion in motion that had a beginning for about 14 billion years ago. So you and I, each and every one of us, and this beautiful ashram, and all these beautiful paintings, and all of our beautiful bodies and minds are all part and parcel of that explosion in motion that had a beginning 14 billion years ago. So one thing we want to consider or contemplate is the nature of the intensity in which this explosion, this explosion into creativity, happen with unimaginable intensity and force. And the inconceivable mystery is how did something come from nothing? How can something come from nothing? Something can only come from something. It can't come from nothing, right? So how did something come from nothing? And secondarily, why did something come from nothing? They're two very important questions. So I have a metaphysical meditation about it, which I could take you through very quickly, which is similar to things I've read in Vedanta. So it's not what I'm saying. I did have these thoughts, but then these are not original metaphysical ideas. But I want you to imagine for a moment that you are Brahman, that you are God, you are that timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless being who is doing nothing whatsoever, no thing whatsoever for eternity. Imagine for a moment that you are Brahman, that you're God, and that before the universe was created, or before you decided to create the universe, you had been doing absolutely nothing whatsoever for countless billions of eons of no time. Just imagine for a moment, just think about it for a couple of minutes, what it would be like to do absolutely nothing whatsoever for eternity. Countless billions of eons of no time is eternity. So imagine if you'd been doing nothing forever. And remember, you're God, or Brahman. So if you're God, it means you're fearless and you're infinite. You're fearless and you're infinite. That's your true nature. So you who are fearless and infinite have been doing absolutely nothing whatsoever for countless billions of eons of no time. Are you there? Whenever we go into very deep states of meditative bliss and emptiness, that's the state of consciousness we enter into, whether we are aware of it or not. But imagine you were that, and you had been doing absolutely nothing whatsoever for eternity, and had been unbelievably quiet, inconceivably quiet, unbelievably peaceful, unimaginably peaceful, overwhelmingly peaceful and blissful for eternity. Okay? It's plausible that one fine day, or whatever, one fine no day, that a thought might arise in your no mind for no reason. Maybe I should do something. Why not? Oh, just a minute. Remember, if you're God, you're fearless and you're infinite. So since you've been doing nothing for eternity, it's conceivable that the thought would arise, maybe I should do something. And the question is, why? Because the question is, why not? Because if you were God, you could do anything you wanted. You could do nothing or you could do everything. God is infinitely powerful and always free and fearless. So this is just a metaphysical contemplation. But imagine every couple of 100 billion eons of no time, the thought would appear in your no mind again. Maybe I should do something. I've been doing nothing forever, and then it would pass on and disappear into the emptiness, and you wouldn't even move. And this would go on and on. Billions of eons of no time would continue to pass, and every once in a while this thought would continue to appear, and then it would start to appear. It would gain its own momentum, and eventually it would start. Eventually, on the very surface on the infinite surface of being itself, would start to accumulate the creative impulse, or the desire to do something, would slowly build up and slowly build up creative tension, and slowly build up creative tension, slowly build up creative tension, slowly build up creative tension, until one fine day you say, should I, shouldn't I, shouldn't I, shouldn't I, should I, shouldn't I, and then you say, okay. But you have to remember, you're God, so you're fearless and you're infinite. So you have nothing to lose, and you're indestructible. You understand? So that was the moment. This is a metaphysical. This is an anthropomorphic metaphysical meditation on the creative process. So that was the beginning. And then energy and matter burst forth, which unleashed these incredibly powerful physical forces of matter and energy, which took about 10 billion years to create the conditions that made it possible for life to emerge. 10 billion years, which in the mind of God is not a very long time. It's a few moments, really. From a human point of view, it's a very long time, but from the mind of God, it's not very long at all. So it took 10 billion years to create the conditions in which life would emerge. And then life emerged from very simple single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms. And then the complexity of life, the complexity of the interiority, the capacity for interiority. The capacity for interiority is the capacity for consciousness. As life forms became more complex, the capacity for interiority, consciousness, complexified and got deeper and deeper. And we're going on a very quick journey here, and then we end up around 200,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago in a 14 billion year journey is like an hour ago. So 200,000 years ago was the beginning of human culture. And when human culture started, is traditionally when it was the emergence of mind, of cognition, it was the using of symbols. And then for the last 200,000 years, the evolution of human culture, the capacity of human consciousness and cognition is complexified and complexified and complexified and complexified. And then around 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, there was these great realizers emerged, like the Buddha, Adi Shankara, Lao Tzu, and these others, who had this awakening. They discovered the infinite ground, this timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless ground, the source of infinity, the source of timeless, formless infinity that existed before the universe was born. This was the discovery of enlightenment. It's only about between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago that this discovery was made. 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, in a 14 billion year process, is when conscious life forms discovered the infinite nature of their own interiors. Before that point, as far as we know, the universe had no way of knowing itself. Because for the universe to know itself, it needs conscious, sentient beings who can bear witness to the whole display. God, or Brahman, doesn't exist as a separate being outside the creative process that he or she gave rise to. God, or Brahman, is the energy and intelligence that gave rise to the creative process in the first place and is giving rise to the creative process right now. I am and you are the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, awakening to itself through the body, mind, personality of each and every one of us. Now, what's fascinating about this is that the awakening to enlightened awareness can only happen in a very complex sentient being that has the capacity for self-reflective awareness. Self-reflective awareness emerges in very complex life forms, which means you know that you have the capacity to be aware of awareness. So we all have the capacity to be aware of awareness, aware of being aware. Dogs don't have the capacity to be aware of awareness. In Zen Buddhism, they say, does a dog have Buddha nature? Buddha nature is consciousness. So does a dog have Buddha nature? The answer to the question is yes. A dog has. The Zen master asked his disciple, does a dog have Buddha nature? The answer to the question is yes, the dog has Buddha nature. Buddha nature is consciousness. Can a dog become enlightened? The answer is no, a dog can't become enlightened because a dog doesn't have self-reflective awareness. So enlightenment happens when consciousness or awareness recognizes itself. Is everybody with me here? When consciousness becomes self-aware, consciousness becomes aware of consciousness, that's the flash of enlightenment. Consciousness is timeless and formless and beginningless and endless. When consciousness becomes aware of itself in that awakening, there's awakening to the infinite. Everybody, are we all together? The discovery of evolution, this discovery of evolution, that the universe had a beginning 14 billion years ago, which led to this incredible creative process of energy and matter, that led to life, that eventually gave rise to mind and self-reflective awareness. This is an understanding. It's only about 60 to 150 years old. This is a very recent discovery that we're part of a creative process, an evolutionary process that made all this possible. So, are we all together so far? But so 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, human beings discovered the ground of being. That was the discovery of Shankara and the Buddha and individuals of that level of realization. And the discovery of evolution, discovery of the creative process in all its glory, is about 150 years old. So this is very recent knowledge. The miracle of being human, especially human beings with a very high level of consciousness and a very high level of cognitive complexity, we have the capacity to awaken to these truths, to bear witness to them. And as we awaken to them, bear witness to them, the energy and intelligence that created the universe bears witness to them at the same time. Now, in Evolutionary Enlightenment, we make a very interesting distinction. If we go back to the circle we were speaking about at the beginning, the experience of timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless being is peace. Right? When we were all sitting at dinner together tonight, and some of you were sitting very quietly before we started having dinner, and after the dinner everybody was sitting very quietly with their eyes closed, and we could feel there was a vibration or current of peace. So before the universe was created, there was only peace. Before the universe was created, there was only peace. So when we transcend mind, we eventually transcend time. We transcend mind and time. And there's a sinking into that eternal ground, the experience of which is peace itself. So peace is the nature of the Absolute as the timeless, formless, beginningless, endless ground of being. But when there was that big leap from nothing to something, from being to becoming, when the universe was created, that big leap took place, that big explosion took place, that was a creative leap into form and into life and into mind, eventually. So that creative leap feels very different. Now remember, everything that's created, everything that's manifest, comes from the uncreated. Everything that's manifest comes from the unmanifest. So the whole universe and everything in it, including all of us, comes from this timeless, formless, and empty ground. So from a non-dual perspective, the world of form and the world of form and the formlessness are one and not two. Right? The world of form and the world of formlessness are one and not two. Does everybody understand that? The uncreated and the created, the unmanifest and the manifest are all one and not two. But the most interesting part of the equation is the world of form and the world of formlessness are one and not two, but the world of form is evolving, is going somewhere, is moving. So the world of form and the world of formlessness are one and not two, but the world of form is in a creative process that's becoming more complex. The world of form is complexifying and becoming more conscious, which is fascinating. So we asked the question at the beginning, how and why did something come from nothing? How did something come from nothing? And why did something come from nothing? And then the most amazing point of truth is that something that's come from nothing is complexifying, is going somewhere, is evolving. And we are all products of that evolutionary process. Now, if we go back to the circle, one side we have being, the other side we have becoming, the unmanifest and the manifest. The nature of being is peace, because nothing ever happened, and nothing ever happened. What was the exact quote from the Master?
I don't know the exact quote.
Nothing ever happened.
Yeah,
Nothing ever happened. So from the perspective of the timeless formless ground of all being, nothing ever happened. But from the perspective of that big leap from nothing to something and being to becoming, God apparently chose to create the universe. But this is metaphysically, this is very interesting, because the ultimate truth, which is I'm sure you're sharing with your students, the ultimate truth is what? That there's only one. Right? Isn't that the ultimate truth? In fact, the ultimate truth is only one and not two. Isn't that true? Yes. Is it true? Yes. So if the ultimate truth is that there's only one and not two, that's the non-relative absolute truth, that you and me and all of us we appear to be many. You appear to be a woman, I appear to be a man. John David appears to be English, I appear to be American. But in fact, my sense of I, John's sense of I, your sense of I, your sense of I, is actually the same I. It's the same I bearing witness to itself through the body-mind form of John David, to the body-mind form of Andrew, to the body-mind form of each and every one of us. That same I is bearing witness to itself. Right? Everybody knows this? So if there's only one I in the universe, which Vedanta tells us, which Advaita tells us, there's only one I in the universe. Everybody agree on that? You are that one I, are you not? Could you be anybody else? So that means you are the only one there could have been that chose to create the universe. You. Let it in. If you agree there's only one I, and I would fully agree with that, and would you agree with that? If there's only one I, then that I, that was nothing, chose to take that leap from nothing to something, from being to becoming, from formlessness to form. And you are the only one there could have been that made that decision. If there's only one, if your spiritual, metaphysical conviction is that the ultimate truth is there's only one, and that's who you really are, then you're the one who chose to create the universe. Which, if that's true, and I believe it is true, puts you in a very interesting predicament. So God or Brahman feels like, as being, God or Brahman feels like peace. The feeling of peace, the feeling of being. The feeling of being is peace. This is what you're sharing with your students, right? The feeling of being is peace. Peace. We're chanting Om at dinner. Om is the vibration of being. The feeling of being is what? Peace. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. The nature of being is peace. The feeling of being is peace. So what's the nature of God or Brahman as he or she took that leap from nothing to something, from being and becoming, from formlessness to form? Because remember, when the universe was created, it wasn't peaceful. It was explosive. The creative impulse, or we could call it the evolutionary impulse, the creative impulse and the evolutionary impulse, doesn't feel peaceful. What does it feel like? So what does the creative impulse feel like? Where did the creative impulse feel like? Where did the creative impulse come from? It came from God, from Brahman. Brahman's the only one who could have created the universe, right? God's the only one who could have created the universe. So what does the creative impulse, what does the God impulse as the creative impulse feel like? It feels like ecstasy and urgency. Ecstatic urgency is the nature of God as the creative impulse or as the evolutionary impulse. How do I know? Very simple. We can all locate the energy intelligence that created the universe if we look into our own human experience. And there's three fundamental levels we can discover it at. The first level is through the sexual impulse, which is the biological command to procreate. The biological command to procreate is the evolutionary impulse or creative impulse, which is the sexual impulse. But it's a biological command, because when you feel the vibration and the pulsation of the evolutionary impulse as the biological command to procreate, what does it feel like? It feels like ecstasy and urgency. Right? Hello? Do you agree? Yes. For men, initially, it feels more urgent than for women, but women feel the urgency in time also, right? So, what?
You hope so. Yeah.
we hope so. But the fundamental point I'm trying to make is that the nature of the evolutionary impulse or the creative impulse at the lowest level, which is the biological level, has a particular feeling quality. The feeling quality is ecstatic urgency, ecstasy and urgency. Everybody agree? Yeah. And and what's important to understand is that what I'm trying to clarify here is the nature of God, the nature of Brahman, as the unmanifest versus as the manifest. So the nature of God as in his or her unmanifest form is peace, the feeling of being. The nature feeling of God as the evolutionary impulse, or creative force in the universe is the evolutionary impulse. The feeling quality of God is ecstatic urgency. So the first place we located, what I wanted to say was, when you experience the vibration and pulsation of the biological command to procreate or the sexual impulse, that's the same energy and intelligence that caused something to come from nothing, that compelled the universe to come into existence. Do you understand that? That the same energy and intelligence that compelled the universe to come into existence, and it's compelling it into existence right now, we all can directly locate when we experience the vibration and pulsation of the biological command to procreate, or the evolutionary impulse, or the sexual impulse. Is that very clear? Fascinating, right? So when you experience the sexual impulse, it's the same energy and intelligence that created the universe, is creating the universe, compels the universe to exist. But at a much higher level, we notice that human beings are the only sentient life forms that exist in the universe that are compelled to innovate and give rise to that which is new. There's no other life form that exists on the earth, and as far as we know in the universe, so far it might change, that is compelled and driven, ecstatically compelled to innovate and to give rise to that which is new. Compelled to innovate and give rise to that which is new. So if you've ever met a creative genius in the field of art, you are such a creative community, so creative. Art, science, music, philosophy, literature, law, whatever it is. If you ever meet a creative genius in any field, the genius, the creative genius, whether they're an artist or a scientist or a musician or a philosopher, tend to be individuals who are driven by an ecstatic urgency to give rise to that which is new. The scientist who's on the edge of a breakthrough with a theory won't sleep. Say, come on, get some rest. I can't. I have to keep going till something's coming through them. Something's coming through. The great artist, the great musician, the great scientist, the great
musicians also.
Yeah, but also think about human heroes like Martin Luther King. The postmodern idea of pluralism and equality was surging through this man's being. So the energy, the compulsion towards creativity, that which compels human beings to be creative, in all fields of human endeavor. What does it feel like? In someone who has truly given themselves to the creative impulse, it feels like ecstasy and urgency, and it's an ecstatic urgency. It's an ecstatic urgency to give rise to that which is new. But now it's not at the gross biological level. Now it's in all these fields of art, science, music, law, cultural evolution in so many ways. So the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating Brahman as the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe is ecstatically compelled towards innovation and creativity. Creativity, innovation. Remember, innovation is always towards something that's new. It hasn't happened before. It's called emergence. The emergence of something that has never existed before. So when Einstein was driven with the theory of relativity, it was a new idea. It was a new revelation about the nature of reality. And when you begin to understand that the drive towards innovation to give rise to that which is new in art, music, science, law, in every field of human endeavor, isn't coming from human beings. It's coming from the nature of the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, which is Brahman, as the creator. is driven towards innovation. Because I want to ask you, if you were God and you chose to create the universe, and you are, if you were God and you chose to create the universe, and you are, would you be more interested in what you had already? Would you be interested in what you had already created, or would you always? But remember, as Brahman, not as your own personal ego. Would you always be more interested in what you hadn't created yet? Would that compel you always more? The next possibility and the next possibility, or would you be more fascinated by what you'd already done? What would you say?
Well, I think it's clear that, I mean, you are referring to this community as having a kind of creative energy. And we've noticed that over 15 years, as the general average became quieter, you could say, as the community got deeper into silence, then as a community, there was much more creativity happening.
Amazing.
People would start playing the piano.
Amazing.
People start going to make clay modeling, going to paint pictures. The gallery has developed over the 15 years, and exactly in some sort of relationship to the depth of the community.
Amazing.
Because now, after 15 years, there's a lot of silence here.
And I can feel it.
In the beginning, there wasn't so much. And in the beginning,
it.
we had no time to paint pictures and all that. You know?
Well, that shows all the work you've done. But if you were God and you chose to create the universe, would you be more interested in what you had already created, or would you always be more interested in what you have not created yet?
I don't feel there's any kind of I that's choosing that. But
no, but this is a metaphysical spectrum.
The course is always new.
Exactly.
It's always new.
So if you were God, you'd always be more interested in what you hadn't created yet, which is the drive towards innovation. That's the very drive towards innovation. So the last piece of the puzzle is, interestingly enough, is that the urge towards consciousness, which is the spiritual impulse, which human beings feel like, I must become more conscious, I have to become more conscious. I must become more conscious, I have to become more conscious. I'm sure that's what brought you to Master Punjaji. It's what brought me to Master Punjaji. I'm sure it's what brought all of you here to John David. Is the ecstatic compulsion, the most subtle and profound form and manifestation of the evolutionary impulse, which is the urge towards consciousness itself. I must become more conscious. I have to become more conscious. Where does it come from? It doesn't come from modern culture. It doesn't come from postmodern culture. Where does it come from? It comes from the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, which is trying to evolve or become more conscious through you and through you and through you and through me and through John David and through Andrew. The energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe is trying to become more conscious through each and every one of us. And how do we know? Because we all have experienced and felt the vibration and compulsion of the spiritual impulse, which at the highest level is the ecstatic compulsion towards consciousness itself. I have to become more conscious. I must become more conscious. And obviously, all of you have felt that. That's why you're living together in this unique situation. So when you get that, it's not you who are seeking for your own personal enlightenment, really. The Brahman, God or Brahman, as the energy and intelligence that created the universe, is trying to become more conscious through you. Because as you awaken and you become more conscious, the energy and intelligence becomes more conscious through you. The energy and intelligence that created the universe becomes more conscious through you, which means the interior of the universe, the exterior of the universe is matter. The interior of the universe is consciousness and subjectivity. As you become more conscious, the universe becomes more conscious through you. So your consciousness and your capacity for consciousness and knowing, your capacity to know, your capacity for depth, is not yours uniquely alone. It exists as part of this grand play. So these three different levels of the evolutionary impulse, the biological command to procreate, the urge toward creativity in all fields of human endeavor, and finally the spiritual impulse itself, which is the mysterious urge towards consciousness, is also the experience of an ecstatic urgency. I must become more conscious. I have to become more conscious. But this is the most subtle and most profound manifestation and expression of that impulse. So the whole force of evolution is working at all these different levels. And when you realize that, it just changes the picture quite a bit. Changes the picture quite a bit. Because so then you realize God or Brahman is timeless, formless being. God is peace. God is peace. God is peace. God is becoming. God is the creative impulse. God is the desire to exist. God is the compulsion to exist. God is the liberated creative energy and intelligence that exists in the universe. And for human beings, isn't it true that we all are at our best when we feel this creative impulse working through us? Because when a human being when the creative potential in a human being is liberated, when you're giving your gifts, there's a freedom from self-consciousness, whether you're painting, whether you're improvising with music, whether you're doing whatever you do. In the flow of creative freedom, there's a freedom from self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is ego and narcissism. But when through creative activity, we experience this. There's that flow state. There's an unself-conscious. There's a freedom of unself-consciousness, and in that there's creative freedom. And I feel that most people, most human beings experience they're at their best in those moments. They're at their best. So in this concept, in this interpretation from this vantage point, we understand liberation as not only the awakening to being, the timeless, formless beginning of being, and the peace of being, and having a capacity to know that and to transmit it and to experience it. It also is when we are able to that becomes the foundation of enlightenment. But then along with that, we begin to recognize and understand that the creative force in the universe is the manifest form of God or Brahman, and we learn to ride that ecstatic urgency as not our own personal desire to exist, but as the desire, but as Brahman or God's desire to exist him or herself through us, and then there's a seamlessness. Because we realize that God wants to exist in and through form, otherwise the universe wouldn't exist. God, it could have only been that one eye without a second that could have chosen to create the universe in the first place. So your desire to exist, my desire to exist, when it's unfettered with psychological neurosis, there's a joy in living. There's a joy in being ourselves. There's a joy in contributing wholeheartedly and unselfconsciously and passionately in life. And we realize that is as much spirit, that is as much Brahman as is the unmanifest nature of Brahman. That's the short version.
If you would look into your life over the last 20 years or something, or if I would look at my life over the last 20 years, well, let me talk about my life. So I can see that increasingly things have kind of appeared, or I don't know if that's the right word, appeared through John David and have manifested, like this community. We found this house 12 years ago, and it immediately was a sort of energetic place, but of course it completely has developed. Yeah? And this development wasn't because anybody particularly had an idea how it should develop. It's almost like Brahmin developed it through whoever was living here, because there were many more people living here who came and went. Yeah? So everybody who arrived somehow contributed something, and then off they went. And so all kind of gifts were brought here over all those years. And somehow together, you can say all these ones who are attracted to live here, together they have something has appeared and something has manifested which completely wasn't there in the beginning. I mean, in the beginning this was a storeroom with bare concrete walls and broken down windows, for example, 10 years ago.
It's so beautiful what you've done.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is it's not that anybody really did this. It's like there was some kind of flow happening through.
Could you call it spirit in action?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
But when I look around and see what you've done, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. But
I think that seems to me that is inherent in what you've been saying.
Yeah.
It's always going to be beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had this little theory for a long time that somebody like Michelangelo, who painted the ceiling and sculpted these amazing sculptures, when he was only, I think, 21. He did the Pieta in the Vatican. Yeah? So who was doing that? Was that Michelangelo doing that? Or was that exactly what you've been talking about, doing that through Michelangelo?
It was exactly, it's the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe working through the body-mind personality, the gifted mind-body personality, the uniquely gifted body-mind personality of Michelangelo.
Yeah, yeah. Since he was 12, he learned how to break stones or cut stones. You know? So he had the skill, and then this force somehow came through him, was in a way channeled through him, and he produced this amazing Pieta, for example, when he was 21, I think. And later, you know, the story of how he painted the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, I mean, he'd never painted before, hardly. And he started with a fresco, which is a special technique, and after, I don't know, a month, it all fell off. Which, you know, you can't really think, well, Michelangelo, it all fell off, you know, what is that? And he continued and ended up with this enormous masterpiece. Yeah? Everybody is touched to see that. Yeah? These fingers nearly touching.
I've seen it.
Yeah.
Been there.
Yeah, yeah. So those are giving us, I think, the pointer to exactly what you're saying, actually. It's very touching for me to hear what you're saying.
So thank you. So what I've been trying to add to when the Master says nothing ever happened. Nothing ever happened from the vantage point of the timeless, formless ground of being, but from the perspective of manifestation, a lot is happening, and that's spirit in action. That's as much God or Brahman as the unmanifest is, and so the universe wants, and it's. The universe wants to exist, and the only one who wants the universe to exist is the one who created it, which is the deepest part of yourself and the deepest part of myself. So if we know that and we recognize and we realize it, it can be so liberating because the postmodern self is so educated and so sophisticated, wonders what's the perfect purpose of existence. So modern scientific materialism says that the universe was a random accident. And the creative process has no meaning or purpose whatsoever. You're an accident, and you're an accident, and you're an accident, and you're an accident. As am I. Nothing means anything. And the urge towards beauty doesn't mean anything. The nihilistic and material, postmodern nihilism and materialism will tell you, well, if you feel that the beauty that you've chosen to create has meaning, you can choose to believe that if you want to, but it doesn't really mean anything. That's also meaning you're anyway. It leads so the recognition that the universe wants to exist, and the feeling of the evolutionary impulse and creative impulse and desire to exist is always the conscious experience of pure positivity. The urge to making love is the experience of pure positivity. Is it once the procreative energy has been awakened in the procreative energy itself? Is there any ambivalence? I'm not saying is there any ambivalence in you or ambivalence in me as a separate individual, but is there any ambivalence at all in the sexual energy itself? No. Right? There's no ambivalence about itself. So in the same way, in the creative the impulse to innovate, to give rise to that which is new in art, music, science, whatever it is, to whatever degree you or I have been liberated into a capacity to create, there's no ambivalence in the creative impulse itself. There might be ambivalence in you as an individual at a level of ego, or me as an individual level of ego. But in that impulse, there's no ambivalence in that impulse itself. And when we can awaken to that directly, we can experience that freedom from ambivalence or division about existence itself. And finally, at the highest level, when you realize the urge towards consciousness is God or Brahman's desire to become more conscious through you. And what does that feel like? It feels like ecstasy and bliss and infinite potential that wants to exist. And then you look out, you recognize your own self in nature, which is the desire to exist itself. And what's the nature of the desire to exist? It's the experience of pure positivity. There's no doubt. Pure positivity. So if pure positivity is the nature of existence, before we started thinking about it, and you recognize it's true, It can liberate us into life. It can liberate our humanity in so many ways. And if you realize that's the ultimate truth about the nature of life itself and the nature of the life impulse, it's very, very freeing. Very freeing. And it liberates your passions too. Your positive passions, your creative passions. Your creative passions, your spiritual passions, they get liberated. And you realize that's what spirit in action is, as much God or Brahman as the unmanifest ground. So, nothing ever existed as one half of the picture, and the desire to exist that's also real is the other half. And it's an important part of the puzzle for the very unique cultural orienting perspective of the postmodern self. Needs to know that to exist is purely positive. Bad things happen in life and in the creative process, but the desire to exist in and of itself is always pure positivity. It's the nature of Brahman. The nature of God is a desire to exist in form. So if the nature of Brahman, the nature of God, if the desire to exist, if the desire of Brahman or God to exist in form is pure positivity, that means you are that pure positivity in human form.
So evolutionary enlightenment is somehow this understanding of the circle divided metaphysically, metaphor, whatever. I'm sorry, I'm not English. But when you say that, doesn't that mean that actually there is no end to this evolutionary enlightenment? That it's not, because there's a kind of, well, when I was younger, let's say, I had the idea of enlightenment that there would be a sort of big bang from one moment to the other. Then I'd be enlightened, and that was it. And then I would always be like that forever. But evolutionary suggests that actually it's not like that. It's always moving. There's no fixed position. It's always going to be developing. There's no end.
Well, you're completely right. But remember, from the perspective of awakening to Brahman as being, awakening to Brahman as being, awakening to the infinite nature of Brahman as being, is a permanent stop. And that permanent stop is an infinite stop. So that's a stop forever, eternally for eternity. And that's on one half, and that is as extraordinary, as profound, and as miraculous every single time, like the first time, which is the only time. Never, as is said, Satchidananda is ever new. Being consciousness bliss is ever new. So on the being side, the unmanifest side, the eternal nature of eternity is eternally mesmerizing, transfixing, and liberating. But on the other side, God or Brahman, that you said it perfectly. There's an infinite creative. There's an infinite creative process that is infinite. Now, what's very interesting, John David, what's very interesting is something I've thought a lot about with this new evolutionary context. So, in more of the traditional Vedantic orientation, the idea is, if you become enlightened, and in a traditional, if you become fully liberated, or if you become a Jivan Mukta, somebody fully liberated in this birth, so it is said, you're liberated from the incarnational cycle, and you never have to come back to earth, you never have to take human form. Right? Everybody get that? You've heard that stuff before. Mm-hmm. But when you start thinking, well, look, if it took God or the energy and intelligence that created the universe for more or less 14 billion years to create a sentient life form that had the complexity of consciousness to be able to cognize all this, right? And it's taken about 14 billion years for the universe to produce a sentient life form that had the capacity to cognize the glory, the majesty, the mystery of being and becoming. Would that be the moment to not want to come back? Just at the moment you went, wow, this is amazing. How amazing am I? Is that the moment to say, actually, I don't really want to be here? No, that's the time. That's the time to realize, because you see, because at the levels of energy and matter and biology, evolution happens at unconscious levels. But when consciousness becomes aware of itself, evolution from that needs conscious beings to pursue it. It just doesn't carry on by itself. So if you just leave it alone and walk away, that development's not going to happen. It's when you, as a unique individual, awaken to the evolutionary impulse and become inspired to become more conscious, that consciousness will continue to evolve through you. So the point is that if the interior of the universe is going to continue to complexify and become more conscious, you and I and all of us have to want to be here. You have to want to be to stay in the ride. So the old metaphysics, which exists in the traditional mythic religions, like in Christianity, for example, if you live a moral life, what happens when you die? You get to go to heaven. Whatever happens to heaven is going to be a place where there's no suffering. But that's an old idea of heaven, because human life used to be much harder than it is now. So the idea of people work so hard, and there was so much violence and bloodshed, you say, oh my God, I want to get out of here. I don't ever want to come back. But it's not true anymore. It's just not true. And so the point is, the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe needs people like you and me that want to stick around, not for our own sake personally, but so that the interior of the universe, which is consciousness and subjectivity, can continue to evolve through us. And the point is, if everything I've been saying was true, if what I'm saying is true, that means you and I have already been doing nothing for eternity. Listen, you and I have already been doing nothing for eternity. Do you know what that means? You and I have already been doing nothing forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So why would a few billion years of incarnate existence be such a big drama? We've already been doing nothing forever. Why would you want to go back to be doing nothing? Now's the time to get involved in the creative process, but not merely as you and I as a separate, vulnerable, frail, woundable human being, as that indestructible energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe, awakening to itself through the body, mind, personality of you and me, as Brahman, him or herself. So from that point of view, where's there to go? The show is just getting started, and for this next phase, we're needed more than ever. Because you see, it's human beings who created this beautiful ashram. It's human beings inspired by that eternal creative impulse, but it's your creative capacities that made this ashram so beautiful. Spirit needed your body, mind, personality, and your inspiration in order to be able to give rise to this particular form of beauty. You weren't. It couldn't have been any man or woman on the street. It was you and your unique conditioning and your unique tastes, and unique drives have had a big influence on the unique form of beauty through which spirit has expressed itself in this context. So when you understand that, your humanity and the unique nature of your own conditioning and your own history and your own unique gifts, spirit can use them to create. Spirit uses them very specifically to create the very universe that it gave rise to, which means being a human being with the unique creative capacities that only human beings have becomes all important. And then being human becomes a very big deal, because then you realize the very leading edge of the creative process is happening through you and through me and through all of us. So that means being here and being alive and being conscious of being alive and being conscious of the ultimate context of being alive becomes really important, and then it changes the picture like in such a dramatic way.
I mean, what comes up for me in this moment is that if I think what was going on in my life when I was living by myself, one guy in one apartment in one city doing his life, and what happens here where, if you like, there's 20 people living together very closely who are, in a way, having much more power, I don't know if that's the right word, but a kind of much more power to manifest. Because often when we're, for example, got a project, maybe a book or something, maybe 3 or 4 people are sitting together, and suddenly somebody has a great idea. But later, nobody says he had that idea. We all had that idea somehow in the same moment. And so we've experienced many times in this community a kind of power of community, communing together. So for me, everything you've said, when you then have it in a community situation rather than as an individual, it's just got much more power and much more beauty.
Absolutely.
So I've felt for many years now that this is this kind of small experiment that could suggest to humanity how you could live in a much more beautiful, exciting, powerful way and manifest perhaps more beauty.
Well, spiritual communities for thousands of years, inspired spiritual communities have manifested utopian idealism. So utopia is the promise of the possible. So utopia is when you, like we were talking about over dinner, the promise of perfection. So utopia, the false utopia is if you fall in love and you have romantic and sexual intoxication. There's the illusion of utopia in the arms of your beloved, your lover. But spiritually, when you speak about the nature of consciousness, when we experience the perfection, that which is perfect, when we experience that which is perfect, as you have in your realization, then we become inspired to want to manifest the perfection that we've seen and that we've known in the world of form. Right?
Well, the way it's experienced over here is not so much about, I mean, it's just words, but it just feels that something wants to manifest through. It's not like I'm deciding I want to do something. It's just something wants to manifest. And so many times suddenly there was a young woman here who'd been quite disturbed, and she hadn't played the piano for many, many years. And one lunchtime she sat down and started playing the piano. And everybody was touched.
Wow.
And out of that, she played more and more. We encouraged her to make a CD while she lived here. Now she gives concerts, you know. And
wow.
And it's like, how did that happen? You know,
That's
how
amazing.
did it happen through that woman? You know? So there is a kind of power that's manifesting when you bring various people together. Not really when you bring them, but when these people somehow are attracted together. Because everybody here has chosen to be here. And you must have found this in your own community.
Absolutely.
That everybody chose to come there and be together.
No, because the power of spirit increases there's a quantum leap of spiritual potential. People come together in this way. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's dramatic and dynamic and amazing.
I mean, I didn't personally plan to live in a community or to have a community. It was not my idea. It was a sort of accident, I could say. And maybe sometimes I might want to escape from that accident. But actually, I can't think of anywhere I'd want to go, and I can't think of any other way I'd prefer to live, actually. It's just, every day touches me to live in this situation with a bunch of very creative people who actually I like. You know, I kind of like them all. And somehow together, when I see what we create lots of books, and we've actually made lots of spiritual films here, because we have... this lady's rather a genius about editing. So through her ability and her genius, we've actually produced 7 spiritual films, which actually manifest in the world quite strongly. We sold maybe 12,000 copies.
Wow.
And that's completely touching because it came out of nothing. She never edited a film before. She was a photographer. And so out of exactly the process you've been talking about, through this lady manifested this amazing ability to edit 7 spiritual films. And of course it wasn't done by herself, it was done also with the tremendous support of everybody around her. Even if they only brought her a cup of tea, that's already supporting that manifesting creativity. So it's very, very touching to live as a community.
Well, when I first arrived in India in 1984, I went to Rishikesh, and I went to the Shivananda ashram to hear a talk. The great Shivananda had his two main disciples. One was Swami Chidananda, and one was Swami Krishnananda. So this is and I was sat in the satsang hall, and Swami Krishnananda, who was a very small man, he was a Vedantic philosopher, but he also was very versed in Western philosophy. And later on, he became a mentor to me, but I didn't know him at the time. And he gave a talk, and I was just like yourself. I had no idea of these potential in the collective, the spiritual potential in the collective. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't care about groups. I didn't want to have anything to do with the group. When I went to many meditation retreats because I just wanted to get enlightened. And when I kept coming back, they said, "Would you like to work in the kitchen and do save?" I said no, because I wanted to be in the cushion and sitting before the Buddha statue. I didn't want to waste time doing anything else. So I was very single-minded. So when I heard this talk, so Swami Krishnananda gave at the end of the talk, he said something along the lines of, "There's a drone. Can you hear it? There's a drone. There's a drone. Can you hear it? It's coming from God. Can you hear what he's saying? Can you hear it? The drone is, come together, come together, come together. In unity there is strength. Come together, come together, come together." And I don't know why, but when he said those words, something hit me like a ton of bricks. And I went into this state of samadhi, of bliss. I could hardly walk. I got up and I stumbled out and walked down to the Ganga, and it took me hours to recover. And I always felt at that moment he was implanting me with this truth that you've discovered in your own work, that the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe at the level of spirit is calling all of us to come together as one. Come together as one. And in an enlightenment context, that's what we're doing. And the Buddha was asked, the question, is association with like-minded people a part of the holy life? And his answer was, association with people, like-minded people is not a part of the holy life, it's the whole of the holy life. And I've come to understand that myself, and I believe that to be true. So there's a miraculous desire in spirit itself to recognize itself, realize itself, know itself between us. That enlightenment's not really a solo journey anymore, but it wants to come together, but in the context of non-duality, in the context of oneness. And then this miraculous creative potential that you described emerges beautifully.
And somehow then out of that, I think it would be interesting to talk a bit about the guru or the teacher or the leader of this community, or should there not be a leader of the community? Because this, I can see, for example, that people come to our community or maybe don't come because it's a community and there is a John Davies in the community who's got some kind of role which most people don't quite understand, but maybe they project some kind of authority onto that role, and they don't want anything to do with that authority because they had a daddy and they had a prime minister or a president or something. Yeah. So in the West, one of the reasons maybe there aren't more of these communities, because actually there aren't that many as far as I can figure out, is because people are very much against the idea of I don't know the right word, but maybe we can say guru. You know, they don't like to have a guru. They don't want to be involved with somebody who apparently knows more than they know and wants to guide them. Yeah.
Well, the postmodern ego says, I do whatever I want whenever I want to do it, and nobody tells me what to do.
Right. Exactly.
I do whatever I want whenever I want to do it, and nobody tells me what to do. So there is a rejection of authority and a contempt for authority.
Right.
But
and a fear of it also.
And a fear of it, but especially and uniquely in a spiritual context. So, for example, if you go to university and you study philosophy, you won't have you'll respect that the professor knows infinitely more about the subject than you do, because that's why you're there. Right. And if you go to study law, and then you're a first-year student or a second-year student, and you're going to go study with a great law professor, you're going to assume they know a lot more than you do. If you study medicine, it's the same thing. But particularly for the postmodern self, who says nobody tells me what I do, whatever I want to do, whenever I want to do it, nobody tells me what to do, is particularly offensive if anybody would claim or claim to know more about interiority, subjectivity, spiritual and metaphysical depth, if anybody would claim to know more about what it means to be truly human, it's seen as being very offensive, because it means that we're not all equal in every way. And the postmodern self finds the possibility of some form of inequality as particularly unbearable.
Right.
So the beautiful thing about India is, because you have to remember that in the West, there's no understanding about deep interiority. This is scientific materialism doesn't even recognize the truth of subjectivity, or their consciousness even exists. So in a place like India, for example, everywhere you go in India, you see statues of Lord Shiva, or of Buddha statues, or any multitude of Hindu gods, and even on drugstores and supermarkets. But the thing is, there are symbols throughout India that represent deep interiority. So there's a recognition in Indian culture that consciousness exists as a fundamental truth about the nature of reality, and that consciousness can evolve, and that some people know a lot more about consciousness than others. But in a Western context, there's no appreciation of the fact that some people could know more about consciousness than anything else. But so you can be a sports guru, you could be a financial guru, but if you're a spiritual guru, you must be a charlatan. So there's a particular challenge in Western culture for acknowledging the fact that when it comes to consciousness, some people maybe have more experience and have gone deeper than others. Because it's okay if you know more about science than I do. It's not okay if you know more than about philosophy. It's okay if you know more about art. But you can't know more about being.
Yeah. But this, I think, doesn't it mostly come from the sort of corrupted psychological issues people have about authority, about daddy and so on?
Well, it's definitely true, but this is particularly a postmodern problem. Because the postmodern revolution was a revolution against authority. It was against tyranny also, for good reasons. It was against the tyranny of authority.
Yeah,
an authority that's been misused and turned into tyranny.
Right.
For very good reasons.
Yeah.
And so the other problem is that people see in relationship with the spiritual guru that many people seem to give up their power, and that has been part of the dynamic of giving up personal power and a significant measure of personal autonomy, and I'm not sure that can really work so well anymore in the West. So I very much think that the role of the spiritual mentor, the spiritual adept, and the spiritual master is essential if people are going to be able to actually find their way. Because the spiritual path is a path is awakening to that which is subtle, and once you've awakened that which is subtle, it gets even more subtle and more subtle and more subtle and more subtle. And it's impossible to go on that, almost impossible to go on that journey and find your own way. And only with the guidance of someone who's proved themselves, who demonstrated themselves to be much farther along the way, do we have any hope? Most people have any hope of actually making any real progress. I think that part of the problem is, and we were discussing this earlier, that we have to give up the illusion that the spiritual realizer, the spiritual master, the spiritual adept is a perfect human being.
Yeah.
Because all human beings are works in progress. Everybody's imperfect. So a big part of the problem is that in the traditional mythic context, the spiritual adept, the spiritual realizer, the spiritual master
is perfect.
Is not only realized the infinite nature of consciousness and being itself, but is also presumed to be a perfected human. But there is no such thing as a perfected human, because all human beings are works in progress. Even spiritually realized human beings are works in progress.
Right.
And in the old model, which comes to us from the mythic traditional era, the master knows everything and I know nothing, and then the master plays the role of the perfect parent, and then the adult becomes infantilized. And so I think these roles need to develop and evolve as cultures are evolving. So what I believe we need to do in the West is learn how to honor the truth and the reality of the potential for the awakening to enlightened awareness, and for the evolution of consciousness is real and it means something. And to awaken in this way has enormous developmental and evolutionary significance for human beings and for humanity as a whole. And this needs to be brought into Western consciousness and to Western culture in a way it so far hasn't yet. And at the same time, we have to demythologize the whole package, which is this usually can only come in the package of the perfect master, the perfect human. And we have to realize that all human beings are imperfect, including spiritual realizers, who have enormous gifts to offer, but are all works in progress like anybody else.
And this is not so easy because there's something to do with personal empowerment, I think is maybe the issue. The people are, in a way, they've been conditioned to follow. So they're looking for somebody to follow. And when it's turned around on them to follow themselves and empower themselves, there is some kind of resistance to that.
Well, that's part of the paradox. Because more often than not, people want to be told what to do and don't want to take full responsibility for their own lives. And then we'll often be willing to give up their own power in order to be led, but sooner or later are going to resent it and get angry, and will feel very angry and victimized by their own choices to do that. But what I think is more important is that we have to find a way to be willing to learn, which takes enormous humility, to be willing to learn about being human, and to learn about being truly humble, to learn about being transparent, to learn about being vulnerable, to learn how to be free.
I mean, this was one of the touching things that happened when I met you in the cafe, in the French cafe, in India, because I didn't know you at all, and of course I'd read various stories about you. So in the beginning I knew you as an amazing character who was putting out really amazing information into the world, very dedicated to that somehow. And then later I heard then, of course, some blah, blah, blah. But when I actually met you, you were talking about actually humbleness. Yeah? That was somehow an issue in that conversation. And maybe this is now an issue in your life. And, I mean, when we would meet you now today here, I think everybody would find you on the edge of humble, not on the edge of authoritarian, for example. But maybe people who don't know you, who read your... I don't know how to call it, but anyway, the stories of you in the internet would make you into somebody who's very authoritarian, and not somebody who's really involved in humble. Yeah? So I'm very, very pleased that we invited you here and that you came here, and what you were saying to us tonight was very, very beautiful for me personally.
Thank you.
Yeah. And was very clear, and I think we can all understand it, can't we? And we're all touched from it. Yeah.
I was very much hoping we were going to meet, because you'd mentioned when we met at the cafe about meeting in Europe. And so I was so pleased when we heard that you'd reached out. Because I wanted that to happen.
It's very funny, actually, because, I really wanted it too. So I put your card in a very special place where I wouldn't lose it. And then when I wanted to call you, I couldn't find this card, of course. I put it somewhere very special. And then finally, one moment, there was this energy, and then I went on your website, and then there was a place where you could send a message to you. So it's very interesting how these things also happen.
Yeah, well, thank you for that.
Yeah. Does somebody have a kind of question to do with what Andrew's been talking about, who would like to dialogue a bit with him? Because I had the idea we perhaps don't talk too much more here, but we go and have a more relaxed cup of tea together and keep Andrew talking until he drops.
Sounds like a great idea.
But if somebody has a particular question in this context here.
It's about the teacher-student relationship.
Yeah.
from what place a student can know and discriminate if to open up to a deeper and deeper trust and surrender to the teacher, or if the teacher's personality is a hindrance in the relationship to the student.
Can you ask the question again without reading it?
Yes. It's about trust and surrender with the teacher, and it's I'm just here for a year and passing through different difficulties and good times and bad times, and yes, and I try to find a place out of my mind, because this every time I get into troubles and into pain, this is all with the mind.
So
and
what's
I try
the
to
question
find a place where to go when there is where to go when I want to trust more and to surrender more.
Can you be more specific?
No, I don't know.
Well, no, because you said it had something to do with the teacher-student relationship originally. And then that was not part of the question anymore.
Yes, I want to read it because from what place out of the mind I can judge where if the where to go. Can I know if I open up myself more or if I run away?
When you say the mind, what are you referring to? When you say the mind,
thoughts.
Well, there are all kinds of thoughts. There are all kinds of. Some thoughts come from. Some thoughts are sublime thoughts. Some thoughts are sacred, sublime, enlightened thoughts, and other thoughts are not so sacred, not so sublime, and come from the ego and are full of narcissism and dark intentions. So, which kind of thoughts are you talking about? Doubts.
Yes.
About what?
Doubts about if I'm at the right, if I'm at the right place, or if I'm right,
Or if John David is right.
or John David is right. Yeah.
Well, but you have to become clear, because you see, the bottom line is, and this is something I learned from the Master, is that unless you transcend doubt absolutely and unconditionally, once and for all, you'll never be free. And I think that Ramana Maharshi said the only difference between enlightenment and unenlightenment is doubt. You with me? You with me? So on an absolute sense, it's very important that at a certain point, once you've been convinced. So, for example, when I met the Master, I was with him for 3 weeks. We spent this. He wasn't known then. He was nobody with him. I had the most amazing 3 weeks of going to sit with him every day in his room. He had a small room in his son's house in Lucknow. We'd go for walks together. We'd drink tea together. He invited me to his son's house for dinner and for lunch. He was very generous, very kind, very gracious. We'd sit quietly in his room. We'd talk. I asked him questions. And then he said to me, "When you leave me, something very big is going to happen to you." And I was thinking, how does he know? And I was full of doubt. When I was with him, half the day I thought, this is the most incredible person I ever met, and the other half the day I thought, he's a crazy old man that doesn't know what he's talking about, and why am I even here? You follow? And then when I left him, the most unbelievable things started happening to me. He ignited a metaphysical alchemical process, which I'm sure you went through something similar, which lasted for 3 weeks. And I've never been the same since. And also when I met him, there was hardly anybody there. So he was always calling himself the Master. I am the Master. I am the Master. He was talking about himself all the time, and I thought he was a huge narcissist. And you had to go touch his feet. So I touched his feet reluctantly. So I was like, why should I touch his feet? Why should I do that? He's so full of himself. Meanwhile, I never gave him any money. He didn't ask for anything from me. He gave me all his time for free. He was being so utterly gracious, giving it, and I was still not fully appreciating what was happening. And when I left him, I looked back and he was just laughing. He was just waving at me, laughing. I thought, what's the matter with him? And then I went on the train, and then something happened to me that I couldn't imagine. I was completely overwhelmed by this metaphysical presence, this force of consciousness that started consuming my very being. It lasted for weeks. It literally felt like I was dying every day, and it was unbearable. And it was a level of ecstasy that was unbearable, and it was a level of pain and fear that was unbearable, and there was a level of, I realized this is everything you could have ever asked for, times a billion. And all I could do then was just let go and surrender, and let go and surrender, and let go and surrender. I realized I didn't have any choice anymore. I was being overtaken by a force of nature, of consciousness itself, that was consuming my ego.
What happened with the dog?
It disappeared. So then when I went back to Lucknow after 3 weeks, I fell at his feet and I burst into tears. I just fell down on the ground and burst into tears because I realized who he was. He was Brahman in human form. That his human personality, which I actually had a lot of problems with his human personality. He told me, I want you to teach. He fully empowered me to become a teacher. But later on we started to have problems because I started to notice that the perfect master that I'd been with for 3 weeks, and he was a perfect master with me. He treated me with nothing but kindness, nothing but generosity, and nothing but care. And he gave me everything I ever could have imagined times a billion. You understand? You can't repay that kind of gift. It can't be repaid. You follow? You with me? But then later on, I started to notice that on a human level, he was imperfect. His personality had flaws. And then all these problems started to come up between he and I. And it got very messy. And I realized at a certain point in my arrogance, I started to forget who he really was. Who he really was is what he gave me. Yes, he was an imperfect human being, but that was irrelevant to the reason I went to see him. And I over a period of years forgot about that. And then at some point around 10 years ago, I was at my ashram we used to have in Massachusetts, and this was the day of the anniversary. In my life, it's March 25th, 1980. It was March 25th, which was the anniversary of my meeting him. And I was walking down to my office, and I had this vision. And I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking about this vision. It was a vision, and I saw the master surrounded by golden light. He just appeared to me from another dimension. This is a true story. I don't know how to explain it. I know these things happen around him all the time. He appeared to me from another dimension. He was just smiling, and I realized that our connection was eternal, and nothing that ever could happen or would happen between us in the realm of time and space could ever affect it. And since then, I've reflected on my own arrogance forever, because I had objections to different issues that actually were none of my business, because he gave me everything and I owed him everything and he owed me nothing. So, and I feel more gratitude now to him now than I ever have in my life. He's even more. He as my guru is more alive in my consciousness than he has been in a long, long time. And I have remained doubtless about that meeting. That meeting changed my life forever. Nothing's ever been the same since. And no matter what, to use his language, appears to be happening. No matter what appears to be happening, that's the ultimate. What he revealed to me is the ultimate truth that never changes, no matter what I think about it. So when you have found what you're looking for, if you have found it, you know it. So if you found what you're looking for, and there has been no coercion whatsoever, You understand what that means? No coercion. It's been freely received, and you know it. You have to acknowledge it to yourself and to the universe, right? Because the mind's going to doubt everything and anything. The ego's going to doubt everything. It doesn't matter how glorious, how profound. The ego's going to doubt everything. Even the most profound awakening will be doubted. Remember, the Buddha was tested by Mara, and Jesus was tested when he was out in the desert. So we're all going to be tested, no matter how much God reveals Himself, herself to us, no matter how much we realize we've seen the truth with a capital T, and there's no doubt about it. We're going to doubt it sooner or later. The ego is going to raise all kinds of doubts and try and get us to back down. So the issue is, if you know that moment has come, and I know exactly what happened in my case, which is what I was describing to you. Then from that moment on, you never doubt it. Now, there's another issue which has to do with discrimination. So, doubt, in the negative form of questioning the absolute and the truth of the absolute, is one thing. But discrimination is you want to know what's actually happening. What's the truth of what's happening? I need to know what's the truth of what we all need to, as human beings, need to discriminate between truth and falsehood, truth and ignorance, right? And the ego has its own agenda, which is very different than what in Evolutionary Enlightenment we call the authentic self. The authentic self is a pure motivation that comes from the enlightened part of the self. It's a very pure motive. It's free from ego. So that part of ourself has a very pure motive. The ego has a whole different agenda. So in a spiritual context like this, or any ashram with any real guru, the small ego is going to be pushed against the wall, because it's going to be the intruder, the one who's going to ruin the party, who's always going to make a problem, always going to make everything wrong, find a way to destroy the purity of spirit itself, and it can and it will. So that's why there's so much spiritual work is about seeing what the ego is, recognizing it, and taking responsibility for it, and ultimately not acting on it. Because if we keep on giving the ego power, it will destroy the most beautiful thing we've ever found, if we're not careful. But that doesn't mean we cease to discriminate, right? Truth from falsehood. Discrimination, in the way I'm using it now, is different than doubt. Doubting our own experience of the absolute or knowledge of the absolute. And the other thing is that when we have these really deep insights, or a moment of absolute depth, and then you come out of it, as you inevitably will, the ego can't remember it. The ego can't, because a moment of timelessness, the infinite depth of timelessness, can't be remembered by the ego that only lives in time. You follow? Yeah. So you can have the most amazing oh my, and then you come back into your ego and say, that wasn't really anything, was it? Say, but don't you see what you were just saying a few minutes? I'm just saying metaphorically. See my point? So,
I mean, this is very, very interesting, actually, what you just said. Because one of the biggest mysteries for me personally as a teacher is that over many, many years, I've met people who I felt had a great potential. And then they had some kind of experience. I thought, great, they're really... And then they just disappear. And I could never understand, how can they just walk away?
Because they forgot.
Yeah. It's what you just said makes it so
they literally
clear.
Forgot.
Yeah. And it's so easy to forget. Well, if this has been for 20-something years, I've just never been able to understand it.
Well, it's because they fall back into the gross mind of the ego.
Yeah.
And the gross mind of the ego can't perceive, can't recognize, can't know.
Right.
The infinite depth of the eternal consciousness. It literally is it's a state of forgetfulness.
Yeah.
And the ego can't know it. The ego will never know it. So when people fall out of it, they forget what they knew, and they lose touch with the freedom, with the unconditional freedom and liberation of that state of consciousness.
We've also seen, for example, people who've lived in our community for quite a few years and had a good time, had experiences, and were absolutely part of the community, a lot of openness and love and so on and so on. And then something happens, whatever it is.
They start doubting.
start doubting, or they fall in love with somebody. That's often the case. And there's some sort of catalyst that happens, and then they just kind of
the house of cards crumbles.
They close right down, and then they want to leave. And we discovered that we can't talk to them. It comes to a point. It's closed to the point where you can't come into them anymore, and you just have to wave them goodbye. That's it.
That's so painful and so tragic. I've been through that hundreds of times.
Yeah.
And so it seems that in fact there's two worlds, two perspectives. And especially if you really want to go deep and stay deep, you can't really have it both ways.
No.
So, for example, remember that if you want to become like a monk in a Vedanta context, you have to take a 12-year vow of not seeing your family for 12 years. And then the saffron robes, the saffron, the color is the color of fire. It's the fire of renunciation. It's the burning away of illusion and all the attachments, and the being attached to anything other than Brahman, him or herself. Any attachment to anything other than Brahman is seen as being false. So we have to. The vow is to take a vow of renunciation for 12 years. To burn away that, at least in theory. So the thing is, what I've been struggling with is because I had a large community for 27 years, and I miss that community desperately, I desperately miss being together in this extraordinary work, and being together in that shared commitment, and in the glory of it, the majesty of it, the ever unrealized infinite potential of it all. It's so compelling, and to share that new world. And then, of course, I was always one of my gifts as a teacher was being able to get people to inspire people to make a commitment to want to be free more than anything else, want to be free more than anything else, to want to be free more than anything else. And so now that I'm starting to teach again, I keep on saying there's got to be an easier way to do this, because I don't want to end up in these situations where people love me one day and hate me the next, where I represent utopia one day and then I represent for their ego being imprisoned the next day. Because the spiritual master represents the potential of unconditional liberation to the authentic self, and to the ego represent being in a prison forever, which is no way. And I kept on thinking, there's got to be a better way to do this. But there isn't, because at a certain point of depth and commitment, two worlds emerge. It's really true.
So maybe this is then in the nature of the play of it all, that people come to some, what you could call, limit, and then they go away, and other people don't come to the limit and they keep going, and maybe that's just the way it's set up in existence.
Yeah, but the thing is that consciousness is in love with itself. Consciousness is in love with itself. So I'm sure you've found, or like you just said, there's someone who you were in love with, and who was in love with you, and I'm sure was in love with all of you, suddenly fell out of love. Because when you fall back in love with your ego, you fall out of love with the infinite nature of consciousness itself. So suddenly sharing the love of the infinite nature of consciousness with another person, with other people, with a teacher and with a community, is a completely different orientation to time and space than loving the separate, than being in love with your separate self, and your separate self being in love with someone else's separate self. It's just a completely different context for consciousness, a completely different context to be alive in. And it's completely different.
So have you noticed in this 27 years what is the main saboteur? Because I would immediately go for relationships. As soon as a romantic relationship starts, it feels to me this is always the biggest saboteur, because we've been so much conditioned about the rightness of this romantic relationship.
Well, that's a big saboteur. More often than not, it's a big saboteur. But I think the biggest saboteur is forgetting who we really are. Forgetting who we really are, and then falling back into the belief system of the small self.
But that always happens as soon as you start to fall in love with somebody, because if you're giving it to somebody, and before you're giving it to everything, if you like.
Sure, that often happens.
So they go together, I think. Yeah?
It often happens, but it doesn't need to in a spiritual context where both parties want the same thing. So I met my wife 32 years ago on a meditation retreat, and when we met after the retreat, we both confessed that we wanted to be enlightened more than anything else, and wanted that freedom more than anything else, and so and that's remained true. So we're still together. But that in our relationship, it never became about us. It was always about the thing itself. But
she's an Indian woman, I think.
She's Indian, and
so that can make a difference too.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, but what I'm saying is actually true, though. Because you see, the thing what makes it difficult is because because modern and postmodern culture, which is what our background, doesn't share these metaphysical values, but share the values of modernism and postmodernism. When you fall, because the ego, the separate self-sense, is constructed in a cultural context. So when the cultural environment in which your separate self-sense has been constructed has not yet seen, discovered, or awakened to the infinite nature, the eternal nature of consciousness itself, when you're identifying with your experience through the small self structure that comes from a modern and postmodern cultural background that has not yet discovered that consciousness is real, from that part of yourself won't have the capacity to remember what you've discovered when you let go of it, when you went to a much deeper place. And that part of yourself has different values, like has materialistic values, or the ordinary kind of the promise of utopia, kind of the nuclear family, those kind of ideas of you're going to be happy when you're in the arms of your beloved and you live in a beautiful place together, and you have beautiful children, and you have beautiful work, and you have enough money, and you go on beautiful vacations every year, and you make beautiful children who make you love the usual two-dimensional story, but it holds a lot of emotional weight to the part of yourself that grew up in that cultural environment that conditioned these beliefs into you. That's where you're going to find happiness. That's where you're going to find security. But when you wake up to your true self, your authentic self, you're always already free. You don't need that kind of security that your happiness is based upon having nothing, knowing nothing, and being no one. Is being free from those ideas and swimming in that freedom is liberation here and now. It's direct. It's immediate. It's nothing that has to wait for or has to be created. And all we need to do then is create an environment that will give us easier and easier and easier access to our own depths, so we can awaken and reawaken and have access to those deeper states of consciousness as often as possible. And that's what keeps the ego down. It keeps the ego down. Sometimes if I teach a retreat, the beginning of the retreat, people come in and you know this yourself, they're in their small self, and then you find out 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and then it calms down, and then a new consciousness begins to awaken, and you suddenly, after it's a weekend or 10 days or whatever, then you meet at the end in a completely different state of consciousness with a completely different set of values. And if you could just stay in that place, how do we stay in that place? Then people go off their separate ways, and then when you meet next time, they're usually pretty close to where they were the first time, but now they come back in the hope of it'll happen again or something like that. So, in my way of being, unless some individuals become stabilized in this consciousness, we have to do whatever we can do to create the most ideal conditions in which that kind of depth will be available to us. And we have to create those conditions that'll make it easier for us to wake up on one hand, but then the most important thing is to stay awake. So being in a relationship with someone who seems to be stabilized in a much deeper place, being in a relationship and staying connected with someone who's stabilized in a much deeper state of consciousness is essential and fundamental. And then having our most intimate relationships with friends, etc., need to be with people who share the same values, the same spiritual aspirations we do. And there has to be some kind of structure to keep this. All these things are necessary to keep the ego down. It's like a wild dog. you don't keep it down, it's going to jump back up and take control of your soul. Right? And remember, the ego we're talking about is not separate from culture itself. So the values of the separate ego come from culture. So in spiritual context, we create a culture with different values. So you come into an ashram like this, you come into the environment, you're co-creating a completely different set of shared values together, right? Different set of shared agreements. That's what changes everything. And when you're sharing those agreements together, then you inevitably start creating a completely different intersubjective context.
I mean, I can remember some years ago, before this community, if I would have a retreat, I was breaking all the concrete. Exactly. Now I take half the community with me, and they break the concrete, and then I can break a bit or polish the concrete maybe. So actually my secret weapon, I don't even know if they know that they're my secret weapon, is actually these guys.
Of course they are.
And when we go into the community, into a retreat, it's almost embarrassing for me to see how much more open my guys are than the regular guys.
That's proof positive of your work.
Yeah, well, of course I'm happy with that, but it's amazing to see the difference.
It's shocking.
Yeah.
Shocking.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you guys. It's much easier now for me than it used to be. And of course, this is another great value of community. I mean, new people that come into this community, they have an enormous
absolutely.
Value, because there's been a community for 15 years. They can come in and suddenly they're floating up on a different level.
They get to benefit from all the accumulated knowledge and work, because people have worked very hard to work on themselves and to develop. And it can, we can all be uplifted by other people's work if we. Well done, bravo. But it's proof that it works.
Yeah.
But that's why human beings have been coming together in these kind of contexts for millennia.
I mean, you've used the word ashram several times, which is okay for me. But in a way, we're a tribe, you know. We're like a tribe from somewhere in Africa, you know, and we're a tribe of people living together in a very intimate way, you know. There's grandma here, and the kid is here, and every teenagers, and everybody's here. Yeah.
But if the glue that holds everybody together and the organizing principle is consciousness itself, if consciousness is primary, consciousness is infinite. It's beginningless and endless. So if that's what changes everything, because that's why you're together, is because of the truth of consciousness, the fact of consciousness, which is inherently self-liberating. So if that's what changes everything, when consciousness becomes the ground of your relatedness, that's a completely different cultural environment than if it's not the case. It changes everything.
Wow. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
Evening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm glad the power has brought me to invite you.
Pleasure's all mine. The honor's all mine. Thank you. Thank you.